Well, hello. This is Anthony Barrows. I'm a managing director at Ideas 42, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to use applied behavioral science to improve the lives of millions of people around the world. And I oversee our economic justice portfolio there, which is broadly our domestic anti-poverty work here in the U.S.
Thanks so much, Anthony, for joining us. We are super excited about our conversation today. And we'd like to start with a question about dreams, your own dreams, and the American Dream Deferred that we explore in each episode. Growing up, what was a big dream you had for yourself? And how was your dream related to, or perhaps more directly, affected by the state of the American dream?
I grew up in the 80s. So I was born kind of halfway through the Carter administration, and so came of age really during Ronald Reagan's tenure. So you can remember back then, if you were alive and conscious, I suppose, and paying attention to U.S. politics, folks like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill really dominating the scene in politics. And my dream was to be a politician. And alongside that, I had a dream of just escaping the place that I was from. And so I grew up in the projects in public housing in Boston, Massachusetts. And all of the things that you might imagine going on in the projects were things that went on in the projects that I lived in. A lot of poverty and deprivation and people not being able to thrive, substance abuse and crime, like all of the things that you might imagine were the things that I saw around me. And that was really my fervent hope, alongside the dream of being a politician and a public leader, was really just to escape all of that.
Thanks, Anthony, for sharing that bit of your personal story. I'm wondering about whether you could talk about your career journey, and for sure where you are now, but also maybe some of the stops along the way. And I'm going to put in a plug for hearing a little bit about the fact that you're a visual artist and how that fits into your journey.
Well, having grown up where I did, when I did, with the resources that I had, with that desire to kind of get out, one of the things that was true about Boston and continues to be true there is that despite having those disadvantages, Boston as a city actually has a ton of resources, even for people that don't have a lot. And so I would say that was one of the most important things about my personal journey, was that despite any of those disadvantages, I still had access to a lot of the things that help keep people well and that can help people thrive. So yes, I went to public hospitals, but they were excellent public hospitals because you're in Boston, the Athens of America, and all the kids from Harvard Med School and elsewhere, wanted to train in places like Boston City Hospital or Mass General. And similarly, went to public schools, but they were excellent public schools that were well invested in. And in that moment in the 80s, we still had a pretty generous social safety net. So AFDC was the kind of so-called welfare program at the time, and it was fairly generous. It's not like TANF is today, which is limited. 5 years over the course of a lifetime with all kinds of other constraints. It was not super generous, but a lot more generous than we've got now. And think about cities like Boston or New York or other places on the East Coast, and you'll think of the kind of noblesse oblige that comes with old money. And that's really what characterized the social safety net then and there, both locally and federally, and really gave me the opportunity to excel in school, wind up in college, et cetera. So I would say that that's one of the most important contexts to think about in my journey. And at some point, I went into foster care and touched another one of the big public services that is offered here in the U.S., one of the things that's designed to keep people well. And again, happened to be really well served by it. A lot of people aren't, but it worked well for me. And I was able to stay in foster care after turning 18 so that I could go to college and get some help during that period. And after I finished college, though, I went into doing social work because I wanted to give back. In the process of having gone through foster care and all the other things that happened in my early life, noticed that my story was pretty uncommon. The ability to succeed in the face of those things wasn't that frequent of an outcome. And it wasn't because people weren't intelligent, weren't hardworking, weren't dedicated to success. It was because the systems that we were navigating were designed in such a way that they promoted failure. And I was really interested in improving those outcomes and making my story a lot less uncommon. So went into social work and worked with young people who were aging out of the foster care system in Boston to make sure that they got access to the things that they needed do you know how to write a resume, apply to college, get financial aid, get a driver's license, buy your first car, etc. And that was great work. Loved the young people that I work with, a lot of my coworkers. And one of the things that I noticed was that despite the fact that many of the people that I worked with as social workers in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, despite the fact that many of them were people of color, many of them were from the neighborhoods that we were working in. Some of them, like me, even had their own contact with the public child welfare system. Despite all of that, and people's explicit commitment to social justice, racial justice, etc., we were reproducing the racist zeitgeist of the world around us. We were still having a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color. There were still more Black and brown kids in particular coming into contact with the system, staying in it longer and having worse outcomes. And this was perplexing to me for all the reasons that I just said, because this was exactly the opposite of what we were trying to get done as people working in child welfare. And so I was always perplexed by that, did a lot of my own kind of reading on the side, some of the popular literature and social psychology and elsewhere about things like implicit bias. And that was super helpful because it was a great explanation of what was happening and why. But it didn't really tell me a lot about what could be done about it. So that was an idea that kicked around in my head for a period of time. And I took a brief sojourn, as you suggested, to go to art school, because in addition to doing the work that I do now and the social work that I did before, I'm also an artist. So I have a bachelor's degree with a double major in philosophy and art and a master's in printmaking. And that's always just been another thing that I do in addition to all of the paid work that I do. So I took a sojourn when I was in my mid-20s to go to art school on the West Coast. And that was very helpful. It was a good way to remind myself that, in fact, I did want to do human services work and not simply be in the studio all day making art. And when I returned to doing social work after finishing my master's degree, went back into doing work with adolescents, but this time, not just preparing them to exit the system independently, but instead to make sure that they exited the system with permanent connections to caring adults that weren't being paid to be in their lives. And so was doing adoption recruitment for adolescents in the Bay Area, and wound up supervising social workers that were doing that before returning to Massachusetts and starting on some systems improvement work in the 6 New England states. And what I'll say before I pause is that the brief sojourn into art is more intuitive and more useful than you might imagine, because there are interrelated problem-solving skills that you learn in art school. And the way that I describe it is kind of like being an engineer trying to solve a difficult engineering problem, because as an artist, you're often trying to express complicated ideas that are difficult to express even using words, but you're constrained in the mediums that you can use. So I might want to express my displeasure with the austerity environment that we live in terms of American social policy, but I'm not going to write a 600-word op-ed. I have to use ink and paper. And so how do you do that without using symbolic language to do it? And that's really what art is about, is being able to translate those complicated ideas or feelings or perspectives into typically a 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional visual object that's supposed to convey all of those complexities. And so it's a fun, complicated engineering challenge in a lot of ways. And it's quite similar to the work that I'm doing these days in terms of translational science. So that's another part of the journey. But to help understand how I got from child welfare to the applied behavioral sciences, I'll have to say that at one point, when I was doing the systems change work that I was doing in New England, I realized that a person with a BA in philosophy and art and an MFA in printmaking is not the person with the credentials that you would normally think of to give like an assistant commissioner job to in a child welfare system. So I knew that I needed to go back to school and kind of stamp my management passport. So I went back and got a policy degree. And it was there that it came full circle, those initial concerns that I had about things like implicit bias. Because in my policy program, I learned that there were people taking those insights from social psychology, from behavioral economics, from the judgment and decision-making world, and turning them into interventions out in the real world that were aimed at solving some of these problems that I had noticed. And so during my policy degree, I said, I need to go do that. I want to get upstream from some of these problems. And that's where I made the pivot to applied behavioral science.
That is so powerful, Anthony, to hear the story. And I have several reflections, and I'm smiling because Karen's smiling, I think, thinking the same thing. One, your own story really as understanding how individuals interact with systems, interact with the places where we all live, work, grow up, right? Experience life, and how that can be shaped based on what that environment is, what you're exposed to. And then your multidisciplinary kind of history, right? Which is, I think, actually at the core of what we're trying to do through this podcast is bring other voices to the table, understanding history and philosophy and art. And Karen is a fellow artist, and I will share with you that we've had many conversations over the years where trying to get underneath an issue, she's shared with me a piece of art that she's produced to try to, in her own way, contribute to here's what the story's about. So it's fascinating to me that you end up in this place of behavioral science, bringing all those other pieces of lived expertise to the conversation. Can you talk a little bit about, I don't think people all understand what behavioral science is really all about. Like, how do you describe it to your family and your friends?
Yeah, it's complicated. So I typically describe it in a long-winded way, but for your audience, I'm going to try to be concise. So in essence, applied behavioral science is the practice of taking theoretical insights from academia that might be generated in laboratory studies or in observational work or in purely theoretical work, translating those things into real world interventions and adapting stuff that may have worked in one context into any number of other contexts. And the disciplines that we typically draw from at Ideas 42, where I work, are the ones that I mentioned earlier. So social psychology, behavioral economics, judgment and decision making. And I'll just give you a couple examples of some of the ones that we think about a lot. So one of the major insights that we use from social psychology is around the power of social norms. And so the very easy way to think about this is if you've ever gone into a new setting, so maybe you went to a cocktail party where you didn't know anyone, maybe you showed up to a new workplace for the first day and were kind of looking around the office, maybe you were in a city that you were unfamiliar with and went into a subway system and didn't quite know what to do. And in each of those circumstances, you can probably remember doing certain things that were fairly similar, which is first kind of looking around and trying to understand what this context was like, who was in it, maybe picking out a couple people who seemed like they were enough like you that you could trust what they were doing, and carefully observing how they were interacting with the environment. So walking into the cocktail party, like, is there anybody else that I might know? And if there isn't, does somebody look friendly? And what are people doing? Are they ordering whiskey or beer, or is everyone drinking cranberry juice? What is the normal thing for people to do in this environment where I have no information? It's ambiguous to me. It's not clear what I should be doing. If you go into that new workplace, you might look around and say, am I overdressed, underdressed? Are people chatty, or is everyone having their head down, kind of typing away at their computer? And I do this frequently when I travel because I love riding trains, but I don't always know how they work. I go and walk down the stairs into a subway system and try to understand how people are interacting with the turnstiles. Is it an RFID thing? Do I have to get a token? Are there the swipey passes? Are people hitting their phones on the touchless contact pad? Like, how does this all work? And that experience really highlights the power of social norms, because what you're doing is taking your cue about appropriate behavior from people like you in an ambiguous environment. And so this can play out in any number of ways in the way that we use the power of social norms. So if you're, for example, trying to conserve energy, there's these famous studies about getting people to reuse their towels the next day. And the most effective message is not save the planet, help us save money, but instead, people in this particular hotel room tend to hang up their towel and not make us wash it every day. And so that's just a fun example of the power of social norms, which is an important insight that we draw from social psychology. And I'll give you one more, which is from the kind of traditional behavioral economics literature. And so the two kind of acknowledged godfathers of behavioral economics, Kahneman and Tversky, their most famous paper was the prospect theory paper. And I'm not going to bore you all with some of the theoretical stuff underneath it, but instead give you the kind of glossy version of the insights behind it, which is around loss aversion. And so the very brief way to explain it is that as human beings, we are more motivated to act on the basis of a potential loss than on the basis of an equivalent potential gain. And their estimate is that that difference is about 2 times. So in order to save myself from losing $100, you could get me to act just as powerfully as offering me twice that amount of money. So we really value stuff that we've already got and will act in all kinds of ways, in very motivated ways, to keep what we've got. But you've got to entice us twice as much in order to make us act for something of equivalent value. And there's lots of stuff that kind of surround that, many kinds of insights around how we perceive and construe value of things that we have and don't have. But that's like really the core insight, is that loss is about twice as motivating as gain. And we've used that kind of insight in a lot of our work before, including helping people maintain access to public benefits that they want and need. And we found, for example, that messaging people about their SNAP benefits, which is what many people call food stamps, messaging people about them with a framing of don't lose them is a lot more effective than messaging people about those benefits by saying, hey, do this to get it next month. So that's another key insight from the behavioral sciences and how you might deploy it out in the world.
What you're offering, Anthony, is super helpful, and you represent a number of the disciplines, quite a few actually, that we're particularly interested in our search to illuminate what's happening in this country. And so I would say if we zoom out, we're kind of zooming in and out as we talk. If we zoom out, Our Dream Deferred, the whole podcast is really all about fundamentally understanding how our country got to the state that it's in and what it will take to change. So talk with us about how you and your team at Ideas 42 are working to really help us get underneath that really big question.
It is a big question, and you might need more than one podcast series to really answer the question. So I won't pretend that I'm going to give you all the answers right now, but I'll give you a glimpse into some of the stuff that we're thinking about there. So I mentioned earlier that I came of age in the Reagan era. And the Reagan era has left us, unfortunately, with these immense residues narratively that have shaped our social policy. And in essence, the quickest way that I can describe this is that our social policy here in the US, so all of the safety net programs and the way that we treat families, is rooted in suspicion and a presumption that people can't be trusted, and an assumption that people need to be disciplined into working because people are lazy. And I typically wouldn't repeat any of those myths, any of those narratives, but I think you've got a fairly savvy audience that knows that these things aren't true and knows that instead people typically, when they ask for help, are doing so because they need it. And I'm assuming that your audience also knows that people are really motivated to work and have an intense intrinsic motivation to be out in the world, being productive and doing something meaningful with their lives. And so typically, unfortunately, these are not the assumptions that underlie the way that we design social policy in the US. And they are an artifact of the kind of the Reagan Revolution, which maybe you can trace back to Barry Goldwater, and maybe you can trace his work and that insurgent right-wing explosion in the 60s that brought us Nixon and then Reagan and then Gingrich. You can even trace that back to the Mont Pelerin folks. But this isn't a history podcast, is it? This is something else. But that's where we're at. What we're trying to do at Ideas 42 is understand how prevalent some of those narratives are about blaming people who happen to be living with low incomes for being somehow morally inept or somehow lazy or incapable, or somehow corrupt and kind of profit-seeking in a negative way. how do we dissolve some of those narratives in order to unlock more generous and dignified social policy for people? Because all of the evidence tells us that the most effective way to help people be well is to simply make sure that they have enough resources to do what everyone wants to do, which is to make their families happy, healthy. And so in order to do something like that, you need to dissolve some of these narratives that we've got, because they are built around the assumption that you need to verify people's eligibility for a program every 6 months. Otherwise, they'll cheat you and take money that they don't deserve. And that people need to have work requirements on things like their health insurance because you need to discipline people into working. These are absurd ideas, and they are cruel at their heart and produce really negative outcomes in terms of public health and economic equality, among other things. But they're the things that we've got, and they're rooted in these narratives that we've inherited from generations past.
What you're saying really points us toward the issue of design, right? To bridge back between art and social policy and practice. I think we've all had the experience of designing interventions that were meant to help people meet challenges and achieve a measure of well-being, just as you're describing. And we've had the experience that sometimes our attempts don't work. And it's really because we don't actually understand what the real barriers are that people are facing. And so I'm thinking here about the work that you and your team have done at San Francisco State University around the issue of reducing dropout rate of first-year students. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Back in 2013, 2014, so one of the first projects that I did at Ideas 42, and we were working with San Francisco State, which is a big 4-year public school out on the West Coast in San Francisco. And they were experiencing something that many other schools across the country experience, which is an attrition rate, a pretty strong attrition rate among their freshmen. So first-time, full-time freshmen were leaving San Francisco State sometime between their first day of classes freshman year and their first day of classes sophomore year at a rate of about 18%. So that's about 1 in 5 students leaving school and dropping out or maybe transferring to somewhere else. And so they were very interested in making sure that they could stem the tide, and brought us in to see if there was an applied behavioral science angle to helping achieve that. And what we found quickly, looking first at the administrative data, was that there was a perplexing 11% of students that were leaving for no reason at all. So some of the typical things that you might expect in a place like San Francisco State are maybe it's housing costs or general expense of living in a city. And so you would expect to see, if that were the case, a strong correlation with people who failed to file their financial aid forms or filed them late, leaving, and really didn't see that in the data. We didn't see people who had applied for on-campus housing and been rejected being overrepresented in the data either. And importantly, in these administrative data, we also found that the 11% of folks who were leaving for no apparent reason excluded all of the people that weren't doing what they needed to do academically. So none of these people were on academic probation. They were doing just fine in school. If they had remedial courses, they'd done fine in them. They'd completed them. So there were 7 percentage points of people who were struggling, and you can understand why they might leave. But these 10%, 11%, 1 in 10 students leaving for no good reason was super upsetting, right? And so we couldn't learn more, though, from looking merely at the quantitative data. So we needed to do our mixed methods work and go in and talk to people and observe the environment. And what we quickly learned from students, staff, and faculty was that a big chunk of those students that were leaving because they didn't feel like they fit in. They looked around and didn't see people like them that were sharing their life experiences. They didn't see people struggling. They had internalized narratives about who they were as people and students, that if they hit a barrier, a roadblock, a struggle, they then interpreted it as, I'm not college material, instead of the thing that many other people would do, which is this is a hard class, or it's tough to be at a new place. And so that was really the root of the thing that we ended up designing as an intervention to keep people in school, was to reframe the narrative of struggle away from something that you're attributing to me as a person. There's something wrong with me, or I'm not capable, or I don't fit in, or I don't belong in this place, to the struggle being a normal part of the environment that was transitory, temporary, and that could be moved on quickly if you did some things. And so the way that we achieved this was to work with the cinema department on campus and bring in current and former students to talk about their own struggles and how they wondered if they would fit in at the beginning, but then maybe got some tutoring or joined a club and were able to persist and thrive and succeed and graduate despite whatever worries they had at the beginning. And they represented the vast diversity, socioeconomically and demographically, racially, ethnically, and age-wise, et cetera, that is the student body at San Francisco State. And we sent this message via a video in the school's intranet to people as they were arriving on campus. Half of the student body got it. Half of them got like a normal welcome to campus thing. And for those students that got the treatment, we also gave them a little questionnaire that helped them personalize and internalize some of the lessons and messages in the video. And then we sent them kind of booster messages, sometimes using their own words, once a month for the first year. And what this resulted in was like eye-popping for people who study student persistence interventions, which was a 10% increase in retention year over year for students in the most at-risk group, which was a group of students that we had stratified our randomization upon, which were students in the Metro Academies program. And part of what we think was happening there, why there was an effect that was localized in those students who were most at risk and less so in the rest of the student body, was because those students had a channel to act on some of the advice. So we said, build a social network, go get tutoring, ask for help. And the Metro Academy students had a push-in program that offered some of those things, including an environment and community for them. But again, that 10% increase in retention year over year was localized only among the Metro Academy students that got our treatment. So we think it was a multiplicative effect. But we take these academic insights and turn them into something concrete, and that's rooted in some of the narrative work that we were talking about earlier, because these narratives don't just shape social policy from the elite perspective of people that are making choices about what food stamp policy looks like. They're internalized by all of us. And so even if you're a person that lives in public housing or grew up relying on some of these programs, you've absorbed those same messages and probably are applying them to yourself and your neighbors.
Yeah, I think that point, Anthony, about how powerful the narratives we tell ourselves every day can show up and shape our own behavior when we don't even know it, both for good and for bad, right? I think the example really shows, and that connection to how do I fit in the real world, in the social norms around me, how can they shape the narrative I start to tell myself in a more productive way? It's just a really great example. So I want to zoom out again a little bit more and think about, as so many of us who are trying every day to advance the well-being of people and communities and work to create more productive narratives about this countries and the communities we live in, are running up against this false narratives, proving stubbornly difficult to shift, even with excellent advice, especially in a polarized climate, lots of disinformation spreading on social media and other means. And I just wonder, what are you and your colleagues seeing? And what do you think can help as we all as leaders really try to take this on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we've grappled a lot with how to think about program and policy design from a behavioral science lens. And one of the things that we did early on was to put out this paper called Poverty Interrupted back in 2015. And what it does is to articulate 3 design principles that are rooted in the evidence from behavioral science and demonstrated in practice by a lot of organizations across the country that are meant to really help people live better lives in a way that is informed by what we actually know about what works. And unfortunately, a lot of it is contrary to the way that we run things in the US, especially when it comes to the social policy topics that we've been talking about. But the 3 design principles there are cut the cost, create slack, reframe and empower. And the first 2, cut the cost and create slack, are really responses to the literature that's evolved around the effects of scarcity on human cognition. And let's just stick with that for a moment. So 2 of the co-founders of Ideas 42, Eldar Shafir and Sendhil Mullainathan, wrote this book called Scarcity, which articulates, more than a decade of research on the cognitive effects and the behavioral effects of not having enough of a key resource. I'll give you the 10-second version of this, which is not going to do justice to the subtleties of the research. But the essence of it is that if you don't have enough of a thing, time, money, food, whatever it is, your brain trains itself on getting that resource. And you've probably had this experience if you've needed to turn in a term paper that you were a little late in writing, or you needed to get that grant application out the door. You've had the experience of being able to tunnel in on getting that thing done and being able to ignore so much of the stimuli around you, which is very adaptive in the moment. If you are super hungry and you need to go out and find food, you can tunnel in on getting that resource and ignore all of the other stuff that's on your mind. But when that is a chronic condition, when you're constantly toggling from emergency to emergency to emergency, you're never in a position where you can pull back and look at the big picture and do long-term planning. But also, if you're toggling from emergency to emergency, it probably means that one of those urgent things gets dropped because you're busy trying to manage getting food. You're not able to manage also being able to pay rent or something like that. And so the researchers, and Sendel and Eldar were two of several colleagues that were doing a lot of this work. What they found in a famous study in a mall in New Jersey was that for people living with low incomes, when prodded by a theoretical financial stressor, in this case, imagining a car accident that was going to cost them a couple grand, people's cognitive performance dipped on the order of a standard deviation of IQ, so something like 13 IQ points, or something like losing a whole night of sleep. And importantly, people in the same income bracket, if they were given a much milder jab financially by imagining something that was only going to cost them a few $100s, no effect on their cognitive performance. But these very strong financial prompts created that impact that we're talking about. So the takeaway from all of this is that we're putting people across our country in a position day to day to navigate this cognitive load, this incredible effect of scarcity, because we're making them live in emergent circumstances where they're constantly having to tunnel from thing to thing. And so the takeaway for me there is that, number one, people living in those circumstances are superheroes because many people manage to do okay despite being in those circumstances, which is an enormous feat. And then the second takeaway, which is the more important one, is that we just have to do better. We have to do the things that we were describing in Poverty Interrupted. Cutting the costs means making good things easier for people to get. So if we know that people need food and that programs like WIC and SNAP are helpful, especially for children, we need to cut all of the red tape, make them much easier to get, cut the costs of things that we know are good. And then the flip side of that coin is to create slack. So not just making good things easy to get, but like give people more of the things that they're lacking in the first place and start with money, which is why it's so great to see so many of these programs like Mayors for a Guaranteed Income and other kind of unconditional cash transfer pilots and programs out in the world, because they're really following the heart of our recommendations there.
So, first of all, I'm thinking it's great to be reminded of the progress we're making around the use of applied behavioral science, the examples you gave, universal basic income. We're seeing some really good applications. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on something that's really of the moment, and that is how we think about addressing two different kinds of narratives that we would say that were maybe net negative in their effect. And one would be unproductive narratives that produce negative outcomes. We've been talking about that. And some of those are unintentional on some level. They may not have been designed in any way to have that effect, but they have that effect. Then there's a kind of narrative that we're grappling with now that is intentionally false and intentionally divisive. I'm thinking of it in terms of how we understand institutional racism. There are policies that are intentionally designed, and there are policies that just by their effect, with maybe no intention, cause a disparate income. So we're now dealing with narratives that are not just in effect negative, but actually are intentionally both harmful, false, and divisive. So since you are right at the fulcrum of these kinds of issues, I wonder what you all are thinking and talking about inside Ideas 42 and what's going on in your head and with your thinking partners around that.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I'll start by saying that the third design principle in Poverty Interrupted is about reframing and empowering. And that is one way to think about the narratives that you're talking about being changeable, maybe being able to diffuse them even if you can't change them. Because one of the recommendations that we make in that section is to treat families like the experts on their own lives that they are. And if you ask people what they need and then give it to them, then you're much less likely to fall prey to some of these narratives. Because if what families tell you is that, well, we need money and we want you to put fewer strings on the money that you give us because that's the thing that's going to help the most, and then you actually just go do that, then you're kind of like doing an end run around any of the narrative stuff that might constrain you. Because there is a narrative out there that says you can't trust people to give them. But if you like step away from that narrative and instead go to the families and ask them what they need and they say money, and then you give them money, then you've kind of cut out that middleman of political narrative in the process. So that's one way to think about how you can contend with these narratives, is just to be much more proximate to communities and to listen, to ask and listen carefully to what they need and to do your very best to give it, because people really are experts on their own lives. So that's one way to think about how you can navigate some of this in a straightforward way. Not saying that it's easy, but it is fairly straightforward. Another thing that you could do to think about that other kind of narrative that you're talking about, which is more intentional and really there to mislead, is intentionally go out and try to affect what narratives exist in the public. And this is something that we've begun to do at Ideas 42 in the economic justice portfolio through our shared prosperity catalyst work. And so we're doing narrative change projects that are designed to figure out what narratives exist in 5 communities across the US where we're going to be working locally. What narratives exist? How do they constrain some of the social policy choices and attitudes as well? And then what can we do working with people in communities? So folks that are community organizers, that are direct service practitioners, that are advocates of various sorts, that actually know these communities and the actors in them, working with them to both diagnose what narratives matter, but then importantly to co-design with them interventions that include picking the right message, but also picking the right messenger and the right channel to see if we can get rid of some of these harmful and false narratives, or at least dissolve some of their power. So we are early on in the days of doing that work, but I can tell you that we're working in New York, DC, San Francisco, Memphis, and Detroit, and that the narratives that we're focused on right now are really around those ones that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, around poverty, that are blaming folks that are in that circumstance for being there and others. And we're finding some interesting results so far, including the fact that there is more of a consistent disagreement about generosity in social welfare policy than you might imagine across the ideological spectrum. So people stereotype conservatives or Republicans into being the people that are hostile to generous social welfare policy, and Democrats or liberals or leftists as being the bleeding heart people who just want to give everybody everything. And what we're finding is that based on some surveying that we're doing, we're finding that there is a lot more heterogeneity across those political categories than you might imagine in terms of how much people actually endorse generous social welfare policy. And in particular, what's interesting to me is that there's lots of people that are in the Democrat or liberal category that are high on some of these psychometric measures on things like authoritarianism or social dominance orientation, that still identify as Democrats or liberals, but that are like super hostile to generous social policy, which to me is a little bit scary, but also like really interesting and promising, because I think there's a lot of room to move those people over and maybe figure out ways to capture and engage with the people that are on the right or that are conservatives that don't buy into some of these narratives. I think that there is an interesting coalition we could develop.
Yeah, and I think, Anthony, where you were going there, the understanding, it's super exciting to think about what we're going to learn from what you all are doing in these 5 communities, because I think there's a general understanding that narratives about poverty are exceptionally deep-seated in this country, and they impact how any of us show up and think about the work as a whole, what it means in policy making and practice. But it's not necessarily what we think in terms of ideology. It really is pulling back and saying, well, how have these narratives shaped us in a way that we might hear a certain word, welfare, and react in a certain way that puts us into some ideology camps that aren't really reflective of what people believe are the key ingredients for any of us to live well, have health, be able to go to quality schools and live to our potential, where there's a lot of shared understanding across folks. So I'm very excited that you all are doing that work in the field in that way, really with and through community and what it might bring to us. As we come to a close, I think it would be really great for you to maybe share with our listeners something that they might study or listen to or experience in order to build on what you've already shared with us. Are there things you'd like to let our audience know about work you're doing at Ideas 42 or things you've done that they might want to draw on?
Yeah, we could do a whole separate episode about that. There are so many there are so many interesting things to kind of read and think about. Let me start by saying that on our website, ideas42.org, there are enormous numbers of publications that I think your readers would be interested in. And I would strongly recommend some of the stuff that we've talked about already. So Poverty Interrupted is a white paper. It's like our manifesto on using behavioral science and human services, and you can grab it. It's a quick read. It's 50 short pages, but it's engaging. You can get through it in an hour or two. And then there's a bunch of the project briefs that we've done for some of the projects that we've discussed. So you can read about how things went down at San Francisco State University. You can read the CUNY toolkit there, which is the kind of follow-on project. So for 5 years in the community colleges here in New York City, we ran 13 different RCTs that were aimed at taking insights that we developed at places like San Francisco State and iterating on them to refine them and improve outcomes for students here. So there's a paper all about our experiences there and some of the things that we learned. And there's a variety of other stuff on our website, including work that we've done in public housing and elsewhere. So explore our website, I guess, would be my first recommendation. And then in terms of the narrative work that we've been discussing, I think that there's a couple places that people might be interested in poking their heads around. The first of which would be Eldar and Ai-jen Poo. So Eldar Shafir and Ai-jen Poo wrote a really interesting ideas brief for the Gates Foundation's Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which was in many ways the inspiration for our own narrative change work. And so I'd highly suggest reading that work and a lot of the other work that came out of that Gates partnership, because there's tons and tons of policy relevant ideas that I think people would be able to get behind. And then building from that, I would say that there's a few other books that are really foundational, but also very accessible, regardless of your academic background. So Scarcity, I mentioned before, which is the culmination of a lot of that research, is one that I always recommend. But there's two more recent ones that I think people may be interested in, especially if they're committed to some of the narrative change work around things like deservedness. So Michael Sandel, who's a philosophy professor at Harvard, wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit. And what he does is he really unpacks in a very accessible way some of these ideas that we've got in our heads about who deserves what and why, and what kinds of obligations we have to each other in a society. And I think that many of the insights from that have been informing the work that we're beginning to do in our narrative change work. And the other book that I would strongly recommend, and another Harvard guy, so I don't know, Boston Crimson Pride, I guess, here, showing itself. But Robert Livingston, who's a professor at the Kennedy School, wrote a book called The Conversation. And what he's doing in that book is unpacking really practical ways for people to think and talk about race and racial inequity and racial injustice that's rooted in a lot of the behavioral science literature, because he's a social psychologist. And that's one of the things that we haven't really touched on in our conversation so far that really is undergirding so much of what we have talked about. Because these notions of deservedness and this desire to kind of protect against the cheater or the mooch, all of that stuff is racialized. And if you rewind back to Barry Goldwater and Lee Atwater and Reagan and Nixon and all these folks, and just listen to what they were saying, it's so apparent that it's all racialized and gendered, much of it xenophobic. And all of it had its apotheosis in the last several years of all of those quiet things being said very much out loud in this last presidential administration that we just experienced. And so what the conversation does is to help unpack some of that stuff. So why is it if we have a statement about the black-white wealth gap that people get very defensive? And Robert Livingston helps unpack some of why that happens, but also what you can do about it.
Well, Anthony, we'll provide links in the show notes to the resources that you're mentioning. So thank you. That was super rich. I wanted to ask you one other question that takes us back to the arts and sort of bridging between the maybe left brain, right brain, and how you are experiencing the times we're in, how you think about it, how you feel about it, and what you might say. These have been very difficult times for a lot of people the past few years. And I'm curious your thoughts about art, music that help you either to feel hopeful or to feel what you're feeling, and the role that plays for you and what your thoughts might be for other people.
Yeah, it's a really good question. When I got my MFA in 2005, I was the commencement speaker for the graduate program. And as you'll remember, in 2005, we were in the middle of really massively ramping up some foreign wars. And so one of the things that I said to my fellow graduates was that as artists, we have an enormous responsibility that's rooted in the freedom that we have to say whatever we want. So when you're in politics or in public service, you can't just say whatever you want. You've got to remember that you're embedded in an environment where you work for electeds and appointeds. And, even in my current role, I have to raise money from foundations and from other folks with money. And it's important to be thoughtful and politic in some of the things that I say publicly. But as an artist, you're free to say the things that you want and need to say. In many ways, you're unbound by some of the things that many of the rest of the folks in society have to be following. And that was my argument to my classmates then and now, is that when the unsayable needs to be said for political or other reasons, who else can say it but the artist, the musician, the painter, the filmmaker? And so to me, that's what art is as an important function, other than the pleasure that it gives us aesthetically or otherwise, intellectually. It's also a critical mirror that we can hold up to ourselves and our society in order to explore things that are too painful to do maybe in a real life conversation. We can do it through art. And to me, this is the ongoing utility of art. And we all just lived through a year and a half of mostly being locked down, or many of us did anyway. And for those of us that were mostly inside, how did many of us cope? It was through the arts. People were watching Netflix and films and movies and TV shows and reading books and listening to music. That's because that's a critical function for us as human beings. We need it. We need the arts, not just to be this critical mirror on society, but to soothe us in times of pain and to help us celebrate in times of joy. And so, to me, art is super, super critical because it can perform functions that nothing else in our society can.
Well, thank you, Anthony. I knew we would get and learn so much from you and your perspective. And I think my expectations were not wrong. It was really terrific to have you with us. Thanks for sharing both a personal story and how it, has impacted where you are today, and then really helping us understand kind of the systems in which we work, the history underneath them, and what are some of the tools that we can bring together to really to have a better path forward, which is really what we're trying to uncover in this podcast. So thank you so much. And we will look forward to bringing you back in season 2 because there's more stories to tell. So thanks a lot, Anthony.
Yeah, my sincere pleasure.